Bold confrontation. Women stand up to royal guards. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as hundreds of tourists gathered outside the palace gates. Among them stood three women who would soon become the center of an unforgettable moment. Sarah Mitchell, a teacher from Boston, her sister Emily, a journalist, and their friend Maria Rodriguez, a social worker from Madrid, had traveled across the ocean for what they thought would be a simple sightseeing trip. They had no idea their vacation was about to turn into a viral sensation. The palace guards stood motionless in their traditional red uniforms and tall bearskin caps. These guards were famous around the world for their discipline and their ability to remain completely still, no matter what happened around them. Tourists loved to take photos with them, sometimes trying to make them laugh or break their concentration. But on this particular morning, something different was about to happen. Sarah noticed a young couple trying to get close to one of the guards for a photograph. The guard, following his duty, began his routine march forward. The couple quickly jumped back, startled by the sudden movement. Everyone around them laughed, and the moment seemed harmless enough. But then Sarah saw something that made her blood boil. An elderly woman with a walker had positioned herself near the guard route to rest for a moment. She was clearly exhausted from the long walk around the palace grounds. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her weathered hands gripped the walker tightly. She had not noticed that she was standing in the path where the guards regularly marched during their patrol. As the guard approached, he showed no sign of stopping or going around the elderly woman. His face remained expressionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The crowd began to murmur nervously. Some people started calling out warnings to the woman, but she was hard of hearing and did not understand the commotion around her. Sarah felt her heart pounding. She looked at Emily and Maria, and without exchanging a single word, all three women understood what they had to do. They could not stand by and watch an elderly person potentially get hurt. Tradition or no tradition, the guard was now just a few steps away from the woman, who remained oblivious to the approaching danger. In that split second, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She stepped forward quickly, positioning herself between the guard and the elderly woman. Emily and Maria immediately followed, forming a protective barrier. The crowd gasped. Phones came out from every direction, cameras recording what was happening. Nobody had ever seen tourists directly block the path of a royal guard before. The guard continued marching forward, his boots hitting the cobblestones with mechanical precision. He was trained to never break his stride, never acknowledge obstacles, never show emotion. But now he faced three determined women who were not moving. Sarah stood tall, her arms crossed, her eyes locked on the guard. She was not trying to be disrespectful, but she was absolutely not going to let anyone walk over a vulnerable elderly person. Time seemed to slow down. The guard took another step. The women held their ground. The elderly woman finally noticed the commotion and looked up in confusion. The crowd had grown completely silent, everyone holding their breath to see what would happen next. Would the guard stop? Would he try to push past them? Would security rush in and arrest the women for interfering with official duties? The guard was now less than 2 feet away from Sarah. She could see the details of his uniform up close, the gold buttons shining in the morning light. She could hear his breathing, steady and controlled. Behind her, she could sense the elderly woman trying to understand what was happening. Maria gently placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, reassuring her that everything would be okay. Emily, standing to Sarah's right, felt her palms sweating despite the cool morning air. She had covered many stories as a journalist, but she had never been part of one like this. She knew that within minutes, videos of this moment would be spreading across social media. People would debate whether they did the right thing or whether they had disrespected an important tradition. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was protecting someone who needed help. The guard took one more step, bringing him face to face with Sarah. For the first time, his perfect march faltered slightly. His training told him to continue, to never break protocol. But his eyes, though still looking straight ahead, flickered for just a moment. In that brief instant, Sarah saw something unexpected. She saw humanity. She saw a young man in uniform who was also processing this unusual situation. What happened next would shock everyone watching and create headlines around the world. The guard did something that no one expected, something that would spark intense discussions about duty, compassion, and doing what is right when rules and human decency collide. Bold confrontation. Women stand up to royal guards. The guard stopped. The entire courtyard seemed to freeze in that moment. His boot, which had been moving forward with mechanical certainty, now rested on the cobblestone. He stood completely still, but this time it was different from his usual motionless stance. This was a conscious choice, a decision made in real time. The three women remained in place, their hearts racing but their resolve unwavering. Behind them, the elderly woman finally understood what was happening. Her eyes widened as she realized these three strangers had stepped in to protect her. Tears began forming in her eyes. Maria quietly helped her move away from the guard path, supporting her elbow gently as they stepped to the side. The woman whispered a thank you in a language Maria did not fully understand. But the gratitude in her voice was unmistakable. The guard, now able to continue his path, did not immediately resume his march. Instead, something remarkable happened. He turned his head ever so slightly and looked at the elderly woman, now safely out of the way. His expression softened for just a moment. Then he glanced at Sarah, Emily, and Maria. In his eyes there was no anger or resentment. There was something else entirely. Respect. The guard gave the slightest nod, so subtle that some people in the crowd might have missed it. But the three women saw it clearly. It was an acknowledgement, a silent communication that said he understood why they had done what they did. Then, returning to his trained composure, he resumed his march, his face once again becoming the expressionless mask that duty required. The crowd erupted. Some people cheered and clapped. Others began discussing what they had just witnessed. Camera phones were everywhere, capturing the moment from every possible angle. Within minutes, the videos would begin spreading across the internet, moving from person to person, country to country, at lightning speed. But the story was far from over. As Sarah, Emily, and Maria tried to quietly blend back into the crowd, they noticed a palace official approaching them. He was an older gentleman in a sharp suit with silver hair and a serious expression. The women exchanged worried glances. Were they about to be escorted off the property? Would there be consequences for interfering with the guard ceremony? The official reached them and stopped. The crowd around them grew quiet again, sensing that something important was about to happen. Sarah stepped forward, ready to apologize if needed, ready to explain their actions. But before she could speak, the official did something unexpected. He smiled. He introduced himself as Mr. Thomas Blackwood, the head of palace security. His voice was formal but not unkind. He asked them to follow him, explaining that someone wished to speak with them. The women looked at each other uncertainly. Emily, the journalist, felt her professional instincts kicking in. This was unusual. Palace officials did not typically interact with tourists, especially not those who had just disrupted a ceremony. They followed Mr. Blackwood through a side gate that most tourists never saw. They walked along a pathway lined with perfectly manicured gardens. The noise from the crowd faded behind them. Sarah noticed security cameras following their movement, and she wondered again if they were in trouble. But Mr. Blackwood's demeanor remained pleasant, almost respectful. They entered a beautiful building with marble floors and high ceilings. Portraits of historical figures lined the walls. Mr. Blackwood led them to a comfortable waiting room with elegant furniture and offered them tea. The women sat down, still confused about what was happening. Maria nervously smoothed her hair, wondering if they should call someone, maybe a lawyer. As they waited, Emily pulled out her phone and saw that the videos were already going viral. News outlets were picking up the story. There were hundreds of comments, most of them positive. People were calling them heroes for protecting the elderly woman. Others were debating whether they had been disrespectful to the guards. The discussion was intense and spreading rapidly. After about 15 minutes, a door opened. A woman in her 50s entered the room. She was dressed impeccably in a navy blue suit, her posture perfect, her manner gracious. She introduced herself as Lady Catherine Pemberton, a senior advisor to the palace administration. The three women stood up quickly, suddenly feeling very underdressed in their tourist clothes. Lady Pemberton gestured for them to sit back down. She took a seat across from them and looked at each woman carefully. Her expression was difficult to read. Then she spoke, her voice cultured and measured. She said that she had reviewed the security footage of the incident. She had also spoken with the guard involved. The women braced themselves for criticism. Instead, Lady Pemberton said something that stunned them. She thanked them. She explained that the palace had been concerned for years about the potential for accidents during the guard ceremonies. There had been close calls before, though none had been captured on video quite like this. The guards were trained to march their routes, but the palace had always struggled with how to balance tradition with public safety. What the women did, Lady Pemberton continued, had highlighted an important issue. They had shown compassion without being disrespectful. They had protected someone vulnerable without trying to disrupt the ceremony for attention or entertainment. The guard himself had reported that he was grateful someone had intervened, as he had been trained to continue his march but had been uncomfortable about the situation with the elderly woman. Sarah felt relief washing over her. They were not in trouble. In fact, they were being praised. But Lady Pemberton was not finished. She had more to tell them. Something that would take this story in a direction none of them could have anticipated. The palace, she said, wanted to do something special to acknowledge their actions and to make a statement about the values that truly mattered. Bold confrontation. Women stand up to Royal Guards lady. Pemberton explained that the palace administration had been discussing changes to the guard ceremony protocols for months. They wanted to make the experience safer for visitors while maintaining the dignity and tradition of the ceremony. However, implementing changes to centuries-old traditions was complicated. There were concerns about public perception, about maintaining the ceremony's historic significance, and about how to communicate changes effectively. The incident with Sarah, Emily, and Maria had provided the perfect opportunity. The palace could point to this moment as an example of why adjustments were necessary. More importantly, they could use the positive public response to the women's actions as evidence that people valued compassion and safety alongside tradition. Lady Pemberton revealed that the palace wanted to invite the women to participate in a press conference the following day. The three women sat in stunned silence. A press conference? At the palace? Emily, despite her journalism background, had never expected to be on the other side of the cameras in such a significant way. Sarah thought about her students back home and how surreal it would be to tell them about this experience. Maria wondered what her colleagues at the social work agency would think. Lady Pemberton continued, "The palace wanted to announce new safety protocols for the guard ceremonies. They would establish clear designated areas for tourists to stand. Guards would be given discretion to adjust their routes in cases where public safety was a concern. Additional staff would be positioned to help elderly visitors and those with mobility challenges. The changes would honor tradition while prioritizing human welfare. But there was more. The elderly woman whom they had protected turned out to be Margaret Sullivan, a retired nurse from Ireland who had spent 40 years caring for others. When palace staff had spoken with her after the incident, she had been overwhelmed with emotion. She said that after spending her whole life helping people, these three strangers had come to her aid when she needed it most. She wanted to thank them personally. Lady Pemberton arranged for Margaret to join them in the waiting room. When the elderly woman entered, supported by a palace attendant, the three women immediately stood up. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again as she looked at them. She moved forward slowly, and each woman embraced her in turn. There were no words needed at first. The gratitude and warmth in that room spoke volumes. Margaret finally spoke, her Irish accent soft but clear. She explained that she had been visiting the palace to fulfill a lifelong dream. She had always wanted to see the guard ceremony in person. After losing her husband the previous year, her children had encouraged her to take the trip. She had been so focused on watching the guards that she had not realized she was in their path. She felt embarrassed about causing such a scene. Sarah quickly reassured her that she had nothing to be embarrassed about. Maria explained that they had simply done what anyone with compassion would do. Emily added that Margaret had actually helped highlight an important safety issue that would now be addressed. The elderly woman smiled through her tears, clearly moved by their kindness. Lady Pemberton suggested they all take tea together. As they sat and talked, sharing stories about their lives, something beautiful happened. What had started as a tense confrontation in a courtyard had transformed into meaningful human connections. Margaret told them about her years as a nurse, the patients she had helped, the lives she had touched. The women shared their own stories, their hopes and dreams, their reasons for traveling. Outside, the world was reacting to the viral videos. Social media was exploding with discussions. News channels were running segments about the incident. Commentators were debating the balance between tradition and safety. Some people criticized the women for interfering with the ceremony, but the overwhelming majority praised their actions. Hashtags supporting them began trending worldwide. What surprised everyone was the response from military veterans and current service members. Many of them commented on the videos, explaining that true honor and duty meant protecting the vulnerable. They said the Guard had shown real strength by stopping, not weakness. They praised the women for their courage in standing up when it mattered. These comments from the military community shifted the conversation significantly. Back in the palace, Lady Pemberton received updates on her phone about the growing media attention. She showed the women some of the positive comments and news coverage. Emily read through the messages from journalists asking for interviews. Major news networks from around the world wanted to speak with them. The story was becoming much bigger than any of them had anticipated. As evening approached, Lady Pemberton explained the details of the press conference planned for the next day. It would take place in one of the palace's formal rooms. Representatives from the palace administration would announce the new safety protocols. The women would have the opportunity to speak about their experience. Margaret would also be there, if she felt comfortable doing so. The women agreed to participate, though they felt nervous about speaking in front of cameras. Lady Pemberton assured them that they would have support and guidance. She also mentioned that the Guard who had been involved wanted to attend the press conference. He wanted to publicly support the women and the new safety measures. This revelation touched them deeply. Before they left that evening, Mr. Blackwood, the head of palace security, returned to speak with them. He explained that he had reviewed all the security footage and witness statements. He wanted them to know that from a security perspective, they had handled the situation remarkably well. They had been firm but not aggressive. They had protected someone without creating chaos. He said it was actually a textbook example of appropriate intervention. As the women prepared to leave the palace grounds, Lady Pemberton gave them her contact information and arranged for a car to pick them up the next morning. She reminded them that what they had done mattered, not just for Margaret, but for countless other visitors who would benefit from the new safety measures. Their simple act of compassion was going to create lasting positive change. Bold confrontation. Women stand up to royal guards. The night before the press conference, Sarah, Emily, and Maria could barely sleep. They sat in Emily's hotel room, going over what they might say, how they should present themselves, and trying to process the whirlwind of events. Sarah kept checking her phone, reading messages from her family back in Boston. Her students had seen the videos and were incredibly excited. Her principal had called to congratulate her on representing their school values so well. Emily received calls from her editor at the newspaper where she worked. They wanted her to write a first-person account of the experience. Other journalists were contacting her, asking for exclusive interviews. She found it strange being on this side of the story. Usually she was the one asking questions, digging for details, trying to understand what happened. Now she was the subject, and it felt uncomfortable but also empowering. Maria spoke with her colleagues at the social work agency via video call. They were not surprised by her actions. They told her that this was exactly who she was, someone who always stood up for vulnerable people, someone who never hesitated to do the right thing even when it was difficult. Their words gave her confidence for the next day. She realized that this moment was really just an extension of the work she did every day, just on a much more public stage. The next morning, a sleek black car arrived at their hotel exactly on time. The driver was courteous and professional, making them feel important and respected. As they drove through the city toward the palace, they noticed people on the streets going about their normal routines, unaware that these three ordinary women in the car had become the center of an international conversation. When they arrived at the palace, they were taken to a different entrance than tourists used. Security personnel greeted them warmly, some even asking for photos. The women laughed, still not quite believing this was happening. They were led to a preparation room where Lady Pemberton was waiting with a team of assistants. Lady Pemberton had arranged for professional stylists to help them prepare for the cameras. The women were fitted with elegant but understated outfits that would look appropriate on camera, while still feeling like themselves. Makeup artists worked to make sure they would look good under the bright lights. Throughout the preparation, Lady Pemberton kept reassuring them that they should just be themselves and speak from their hearts. Margaret arrived shortly after, looking lovely in a soft blue dress. Her children had traveled to be with her for this important moment. She introduced them to Sarah, Emily, and Maria. Her daughter, Catherine, hugged each of the women tightly. Her son, Patrick, shook their hands with tears in his eyes, thanking them for protecting his mother. The emotional reunion reminded everyone what this was really about. Then came a surprise that none of them expected. The guard from the incident walked into the room. He was out of uniform, wearing a neat suit, looking much younger than he had appeared in his ceremonial dress. He introduced himself as James Carter, a 24-year-old guard who had been serving for 3 years. His presence made everyone momentarily quiet. James spoke to the women with genuine warmth. He thanked them for their intervention. He explained that in his training, guards were taught to maintain their march and their composure no matter what. But he had been increasingly uncomfortable with situations where tourists, especially elderly or disabled visitors, ended up too close to the march routes. He had wanted to advocate for changes but did not know how to do so within the rigid structure of his duties. What the women did, James said, gave him and his fellow guards a voice. It brought attention to concerns they had shared among themselves but never felt empowered to raise officially. He wanted them to know that the guards were not upset about the incident. Most of them were actually relieved that someone had finally highlighted the need for better safety measures. James also apologized to Margaret for the fear she must have felt. Margaret, ever gracious, told him that she understood he was doing his job and that she held no ill feelings toward him. The conversation between them was touching, showing that this situation had brought out the humanity in everyone involved. As the time for the press conference approached, Lady Pemberton gathered everyone together for a final briefing. She explained the format of the event. Palace officials would speak first about the new safety protocols. Then Sarah, Emily, and Maria would have the opportunity to share their perspective. Margaret and James would also speak if they felt comfortable. Questions from the press would follow. Lady Pemberton emphasized that this was not about making them into heroes. It was about having an honest conversation about balancing tradition with compassion. The palace wanted to show that institutions could listen, learn, and adapt. The women appreciated this approach. They did not want glory. They simply wanted to know that what they did mattered and would lead to positive change. The group was led down a long corridor lined with portraits and historical artifacts. Sarah felt like she was walking through history itself. Emily's journalist instincts were noting every detail, already mentally drafting the article she would write. Maria squeezed Margaret's hand gently, providing support and comfort as they walked together. They reached a grand door, ornately decorated with gold trim. Beyond it, they could hear the murmur of voices, the clicking of cameras, the rustle of movement as dozens of journalists prepared for the press conference. Mr. Blackwood appeared at the door, giving them a reassuring nod. He opened the door slowly and bright lights flooded the hallway. The room was filled with reporters from around the world.
Cameras lined the back wall.
Journalists sat with notepads ready, recorders running. At the front of the room was a long table with microphones and nameplates. Behind it hung the official palace insignia. The sight was intimidating, but Lady Pemberton walked in confidently and the others followed her lead. As they took their seats at the table, the room grew quiet. Cameras flashed continuously. Sarah looked out at the sea of faces and felt her heart pounding. Emily felt surprisingly calm, drawing on her experience covering events like this even though she had never been at the center of one. Maria thought about all the people she had advocated for in her work and drew strength from that purpose. Bold confrontation. Women stand up to Royal Guards Lady. Pemberton stood and approached the podium. The room fell completely silent. She began by thanking the media for their attendance and for the thoughtful coverage the incident had received. She acknowledged that the palace took its traditions seriously, but also took seriously its responsibility to ensure visitor safety and to demonstrate the values of compassion and human dignity. She announced a comprehensive set of new protocols. Clear designated viewing areas would be established along guard routes. Additional staff would be stationed to assist elderly visitors and those with mobility challenges. Guards would receive updated training that gave them discretion to adjust their routes when public safety was a concern. Educational materials would be provided to visitors explaining proper etiquette and safety guidelines. Most importantly, Lady Pemberton emphasized that these changes were not about diminishing tradition, but about honoring what truly mattered. The ceremony would continue with all its historic significance, but it would be carried out in a way that reflected modern values of inclusivity and care for all visitors. The announcement was met with murmurs of approval from the journalists. Then it was time for Sarah, Emily, and Maria to speak. Sarah went first, her voice slightly shaky at the beginning but growing stronger as she spoke. She explained that they were just three ordinary people who saw someone in need and responded instinctively. She talked about teaching her students to stand up for others, and how this moment had been an opportunity to live those values she taught. Sarah emphasized that they had tremendous respect for the guards and the traditions they upheld. They never wanted to disrupt the ceremony or cause a scene. They simply could not stand by and watch someone potentially get hurt. She hoped their actions would inspire others to choose compassion when faced with difficult situations. Her words were heartfelt and genuine, and the room responded with appreciation. Emily spoke next, bringing her journalist perspective to the moment. She talked about the power of ordinary people to create change. She noted that social media and modern communication had allowed this incident to spark a global conversation about how we balance tradition with human welfare. She praised the palace for its willingness to listen and adapt. She also challenged other institutions to examine their own practices and make necessary changes. Maria shared her experience as a social worker, explaining that her job involved advocating for vulnerable populations every day. She saw Margaret not as a stranger but as someone's mother, grandmother, someone who deserved protection and dignity. She expressed hope that this incident would remind people that true strength comes from protecting others, not from rigid adherence to rules when those rules might cause harm. Then Margaret took the microphone. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was clear. She thanked the three women again, calling them her angels. She shared that after losing her husband, she had felt alone in the world. But the kindness of these strangers had restored her faith in humanity. She expressed gratitude to the palace for the changes they were implementing, changes that would protect other elderly visitors in the future. Margaret also wanted to speak directly to the guard, James Carter. She looked at him with warm eyes and said that she understood he was a young man doing his duty with honor. She held no negative feelings toward him, and hoped people would not criticize him for simply following his training. Her words brought visible relief to James's face and also brought tears to many eyes in the room. Finally, James spoke. He thanked Margaret for her understanding and forgiveness. He explained the difficulty guards faced when their duty seemed to conflict with their natural human instincts to protect others. He supported the new safety protocols wholeheartedly and believed they would allow guards to serve with both honor and humanity. He praised Sarah, Emily, and Maria for their courage and for giving voice to concerns that guards had long held privately. The question period that followed was respectful and thoughtful. Journalists asked about the specific new protocols, about how the women felt in the moment, about what message this sent to other tourist destinations worldwide. The answers were candid and heartfelt. What emerged was a story not about conflict but about collaboration, not about breaking rules but about making them better. One particularly moving moment came when a reporter asked Sarah what she would tell her students about this experience. Sarah paused, thinking carefully before answering. She said she would tell them that doing the right thing is not always comfortable or easy. Sometimes it means stepping outside your normal role, risking criticism and trusting your moral compass. But those uncomfortable moments are often the ones that matter most. Emily was asked about the role of social media in amplifying the incident. She acknowledged that while social media could sometimes spread negativity, in this case it had facilitated an important conversation. It had allowed people from different cultures and backgrounds to discuss shared values. It had put pressure on institutions to respond quickly and thoughtfully. Used well, these platforms could be forces for positive change. A reporter asked Maria about the moment she decided to step forward. Maria explained that there was no real decision process. It was instinct, informed by years of training and experience in protecting vulnerable people. She hoped that everyone would cultivate that instinct, that immediate response to help others. Society needed more people who acted without overthinking, who let compassion guide their actions. Near the end of the press conference, a journalist asked what surprised them most about the whole experience. The three women looked at each other and smiled. Emily answered for them all. She said they were most surprised by the overwhelmingly positive response. They had worried about being criticized for disrespecting tradition. Instead, they found that most people understood and supported their actions. It reinforced their belief in basic human goodness. As the press conference concluded, something unexpected happened. The journalists in the room began to applaud. It started with just a few people but quickly spread throughout the room. It was not typical for press conferences to end this way. But this was not a typical press conference. It was a moment of recognition that something meaningful had occurred, something that resonated beyond the immediate incident. After the formal event ended, several journalists approached the women individually, wanting more personal stories, more details about their backgrounds and lives. Margaret was surrounded by well-wishers. James found himself being interviewed about the guard's perspective, an opportunity he welcomed. The energy in the room was positive and hopeful, quite different from the tension that might have been expected. Bold confrontation. Women stand up to royal guards. In the weeks following the press conference, the impact of the incident continued to grow. News outlets around the world ran follow-up stories. The video had been viewed hundreds of millions of times. More importantly, the conversation it sparked led to tangible changes not just at the palace, but at tourist destinations worldwide. Other historic sites began reviewing their visitor safety protocols, recognizing that tradition and safety could coexist. Sarah returned to her classroom in Boston to find her students had created a special presentation about the incident. They had researched the importance of standing up for others and created projects exploring moments in history when ordinary people made a difference. Her principal asked her to speak at a school assembly about the experience. Sarah was humbled by the attention but grateful for the teaching opportunity it provided. Emily wrote a powerful first-person article about the experience that was picked up by major publications internationally. She reflected on the thin line between being an observer and being a participant in the news. She wrote about the responsibility everyone has to act when they witness something wrong, even if it means stepping outside their comfort zone. Her article sparked discussions in journalism schools about ethics and personal responsibility. Maria found that the incident reinforced her commitment to social work. Her agency used the story in their training materials as an example of appropriate intervention and advocacy. She was invited to speak at conferences about recognizing vulnerability and responding with compassion. She remained humble about the attention, always emphasizing that she had simply done what her training and values had prepared her to do. Margaret became something of a celebrity herself. Her grace and kindness throughout the incident touched people deeply. She received letters from around the world, many from elderly people who felt validated and protected by what had happened. She used her newfound platform to advocate for better accessibility at tourist sites and public spaces. Her children were amazed at her energy and purpose, saying she had found a new mission in life. James continued his service as a guard, but now with the confidence that came from knowing his concerns about safety had been heard. The new protocols made his job easier and more fulfilling. He no longer worried about potential accidents during ceremonies. Other guards thanked him for speaking out at the press conference. He became an informal spokesman for the guards, helping to bridge the gap between tradition and modern expectations. The palace implemented the new safety measures within 2 months. The changes were well received by tourists and guards alike. Incidents and near misses dropped dramatically. Visitor satisfaction actually increased because people felt safer and more comfortable during the ceremonies. The palace became a model for how historic institutions could adapt while maintaining their cultural significance. 6 months after the incident, the palace invited Sarah, Emily, Maria, and Margaret back for a special ceremony. They were presented with commendations recognizing their actions and their contribution to improving visitor safety. The ceremony was private and dignified, exactly what the 4 women had hoped for. They did not want more publicity, just acknowledgement that their simple act had led to meaningful change. During that visit, the 4 women had time to reflect together on how their lives had changed. They had remained in close contact, forming a bond that transcended the incident that brought them together. They talked about how one moment of decision had rippled outward, affecting not just themselves but countless others. They marveled at how something so simple had resonated so deeply with people around the world. Margaret shared that she had written a memoir about her nursing career, inspired by the attention the incident had brought her. Publishers were interested, seeing it as a story about a life dedicated to helping others, culminating in being helped when she needed it most. She was excited about the project and the opportunity to honor the patients she had cared for over her 40-year career. The women also met with James again during the visit. He had been promoted and was now involved in training new guards. He incorporated lessons from the incident into his training sessions, teaching guards how to balance duty with compassion. He told the women that new guards often asked about the famous incident and were inspired by how it led to positive change rather than conflict and punishment. The broader impact of the incident extended into unexpected areas. Schools incorporated the story into ethics curricula. Business schools used it as a case study about institutional change and stakeholder management. Psychology programs discussed it in the context of moral decision-making and bystander intervention. The incident became a teaching tool across multiple disciplines. Perhaps most significantly, the incident inspired a wave of similar interventions worldwide. People became more willing to step in when they saw someone in need of help. The phrase that became associated with the incident was simple but powerful: compassion over compliance. It captured the idea that rules and traditions should serve people, not the other way around. A year after the incident, a documentary filmmaker approached the women about creating a film that would explore not just what happened, but why it resonated so deeply with people. The film would examine themes of duty versus humanity, tradition versus progress, and individual action versus institutional responsibility. The women agreed to participate, hoping the film would extend the positive impact even further. The documentary, when it was released, won several awards and was shown in schools and community centers worldwide. It featured interviews with the four women, James, Lady Pemberton, and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by the story. It examined how a single moment of courage and compassion could create waves of positive change that extended far beyond the original incident. Looking back, the women often reflected on how unpredictable life could be. They had gone to the palace that morning as tourists, expecting nothing more than photos and memories. Instead, they had found themselves at the center of a global conversation about values, responsibility, and human dignity. They had not sought attention or recognition, but when faced with a choice, they had chosen compassion. The lasting legacy of the confrontation was not about the clash between tourists and guards. It was about what happened after that moment. It was about institutions listening and adapting. It was about people around the world being inspired to act with kindness and courage. It was about a young guard finding his voice. It was about an elderly woman's dignity being protected. It was about three friends who simply did what they believed was right. The incident proved that ordinary people could make a difference. It showed that standing up for others, even in small ways, could create ripples that extended far beyond the immediate moment. It demonstrated that institutions could change when challenged thoughtfully and respectfully. Most importantly, it reminded everyone that at the heart of all traditions, rules, and ceremonies should be a simple principle: human dignity matters most. Years later, visitors to the palace would still hear about the incident during tours. Guides would point to the spot where it happened and explain how three women's courage led to important changes. The story became part of the palace's history, not as a moment of conflict, but as a moment of evolution, when tradition and compassion found a way to work together. Sarah, Emily, and Maria remained close friends, meeting annually at the palace to commemorate the anniversary of the incident. Margaret joined them until her passing at the age of 87, surrounded by family and the three women who had become like daughters to her. Her legacy lived on through her memoir and through the countless people inspired by her grace and forgiveness. The bold confrontation that stunned everyone ultimately became a story of hope. It proved that one moment of courage could change not just individual lives but entire systems. It showed that doing the right thing, even when difficult or uncomfortable, was always worth it. And it reminded the world that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with simple acts of kindness and the courage to stand up when it matters most.